Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, the summer of 2019 session. So our book is Introduction to World Philosophy, and in this video we are going to compare St. Thomas Aquinas and Plato. The question isn't a question this time, so this is exam 4, part A, question 3, and it's just telling you to combine. So combine St. Thomas Aquinas' concept of natural law, especially his notion of the good, with Plato's concept of the idea of the good in the Cave Allegory of the Republic, and Plato's theory of absolute ideas in the Phaedrus, to form a more complete version of natural law theory. You do not have to believe the theory, just combine the elements of the different readings logically. So you're combining St. Thomas Aquinas, so that's in chapter 4.5.1, Summa Theologica, to Plato's Cave Allegory in the Republic and the Phaedrus. So those the segments that we covered in this class. So Aquinas was basing his philosophy on Aristotle, but also on Plato, and especially through St. Augustine. So St. Augustine came at the end of the Roman Empire. St. Thomas Aquinas came, and he lived 1224 to 1274, so almost 1,000 years after Augustine. Augustine was more of a Platonist, and Aquinas, again, liked to follow Aristotle, and Aristotle's idea of the forms are a little different than Plato's, but when you combine Aquinas with Plato, this is the overall, what I'm looking for, the elements. For Plato, in the Phaedrus, we saw that he says after death and before your next reincarnation, your soul struggles to go to the outermost heaven of the universe, where it can perceive the absolute ideas of justice and beauty and goodness and everything. And that's the source of the material world, the interior of the universe. So in the Cave Allegory, you're trying to, this three-dimensional world that we live in, our everyday world, which is illuminated by the sun, is compared to the cave where the prisoners are shackled. And just to briefly overview, to describe his theory, his metaphysics, Socrates says, imagine we are in a cave, prisoners chained in a cave at birth, shackled head to foot, forced to look at the back of a cave. Behind them is a blazing fire above the entrance, and between them and the fire, guards carried puppets up on sticks, puppets of the different three-dimensional figures out in the real world. You know, whatever the case may be, all the different species of being, so that the prisoners and the guards, their shadow is hidden by a wall, a wall that comes up a little bit, enough to hide the guards but not the puppets. So the prisoners think the shadows on the wall are reality. Then someone takes the prisoner, turns them around. They're blinded by the firelight. They can't see anything. They think the shadows are still more real. They're dragged up the rough and steep ascent. They can see things at night. They can see things in puddles of water in the daytime. Eventually their eyes get habituated enough to the light that they can catch a glimpse of the sun itself, and then they realize, oh, all the stuff in the cave was just shadows and delusion, and here's reality. So then he's taken back to the cave. He's blinded by the darkness. People think he's insane. They want to kill him if they could. But eventually his eyes accustom themselves to the dark, and he can understand the shadow game better, 10,000 times better than anybody else. And his job is supposed to be to bring other prisoners back out of the cave. So the cave is what our world is. The sun is like the fire in the cave. This is a shadow. The three-dimensional objects, our bodies, everything we see, are like shadows of the absolute forms in the eternal spiritual world. So that's the Cave Allegory. So to combine that with St. Thomas Aquinas, I will now just read a little bit of the introductory notes on page 124. So Aquinas on law and virtue. So I'll just read a few, I'll skip around a little bit. So Aquinas bases his views on ethics on those of Aristotle, but he adds many innovations, blending Aristotelian insights into a Christian worldview. He develops a comprehensive theory of natural law that remains influential today. So Aquinas begins with Aristotle's idea that human good depends on human nature. To live well, to excel or flourish, is to fulfill one's function well. So our function as human beings, according to Aristotle, is to act according to reason. And he says to act well, we have to act virtuously. Reason determines the golden mean between two extremes of vice. One of going too far, one of not going far enough. So, for example, courage is the mean between cowardice, which is not going far enough, and rashness, which is going too far. Reason enables us to determine the virtuous golden mean. According to Aristotle, our function specifically as humans is to reason. We have a vegetative function, which we hold in common with all living things. Even plants just nourish themselves and grow. We have sense perceptions, which the animals have. We have that in common with animals. But the one thing humans have that no other animal has is reason. So to function well, you have to perform according to reason as a human being. So this is related to Aquinas' natural law theory. So the natural law is, what is the moral law? How do you determine what's ethical and what is not ethical? You have to use reason, he's going to say, to determine what's natural for the human form. So God created human beings for a specific purpose. The specific purpose is to use our reason ultimately to discern God's will by studying the eternal law that governs the universe. So let me get back to the introductory notes. So Aquinas adds God to this Aristotelian picture. God establishes the order of nature, determining the nature of things. God thus indirectly establishes not only the physical laws that constitute the order of nature, but also the natural laws that free beings ought to obey. Since human nature is distinctively rational, law itself is essentially a matter of reason. All right, so you have to understand just the terms here. So, they write it a little bit confusingly. So God thus indirectly establishes not only the physical laws. Well, God directly establishes the physical laws that constitute the order of nature. And then from those, indirectly, God establishes the natural laws that free beings ought to obey, because God made humans rational, and we can therefore use reason to determine what human beings ought to do by examining the eternal laws of nature, the laws of physics, the way God established the universe. So you can see the moral order in the physical order of things, because God formed things for a purpose, and when they fulfill the function for which God created them, that's good. And when they're not fulfilling that function, then that's evil. And so for human beings, when we're fulfilling the function for which God created us, we're doing something ethically good. And when we're going against what it is reasonable to assume a human form should be doing, then that's evil. So the eternal law is one term, and then the law of nature is another term. And it gets confusing when they talk about, all right, so the law of nature and natural law, those are the two words. The law of nature is physics. So it says here, Aquinas distinguishes several different kinds of law. Eternal law is the law of nature, established by God, that governs the entire universe. Everything in the universe obeys eternal law and does so necessarily. Science investigates eternal law and tries to describe it. Natural law is normative. It prescribes what things should do and be. Since a thing's nature determines its function and thus its virtue, what it ought to do and be, eternal law determines natural law. Natural law is the manifestation of eternal law in creatures capable of rational choice and activity. Okay, so eternal law is the law of nature. Eternal law is the law of physics that God establishes to govern the universe. It's necessarily true. The laws of physics, according to Aquinas, are necessarily true everywhere in the universe. Now, natural law, as opposed to law of nature. So natural law is just what they're calling the moral law that humans can discern by using reason and studying the eternal law, which includes the laws of the physical that govern the physical universe. And I think if you're going to combine this with Plato, it's interesting to note in the Cave Allegory, it is introduced with the divided line idea. So Socrates says, imagine there's two worlds, the intellectual world of eternal absolute forms or ideas, and then this material world. Now so there's a line divided in two unequal portions, the upper portion being larger and the bottom portion being smaller. Now divide each of those segments in the same proportion. So you have 4 segments. So the two bottom segments are the material world. At the bottom level are shadows and mirror reflections of 3-dimensional objects at the top level of the material world. So this physical body here, or this pen, anything, that's at the top level of the material world, actual physical objects. At the bottom level are the shadows they cast or the reflections that they cast in a mirror. And then the 2 levels of the intellectual world at the bottom are the mathematical forms that describe the 3-dimensional physical objects that we perceive. So the 3-dimensional objects we perceive are actually always changing. They're never the same from one moment to the next. But the mathematical forms that describe the ever-changing physical forms are eternal and fixed. That's why they belong to the eternal world of the intellect. That's the laws of physics. That when we study the laws of physics, like general relativity, quantum mechanics, and some people say string theory, which combines those 2 previous forms of the laws of nature, that we then have that level of the intellectual world is like a shadow or a mirror reflection of the higher level, where we find things like absolute justice. So that is the realm of the normative, the moral laws. So you can, just like you can study an object by looking at its mirror reflection, you can study the moral laws by looking at its mirror reflection, which are the laws of physics, the laws of nature. So to develop a natural law theory, if you combine these two, there's just a more comprehensive theory. Another part of combining these two would be reincarnation, something that Aquinas did not believe in. But we saw in the Phaedrus that you see those absolute ideas at the highest level of the intellectual world, at the outermost sphere of the universe, where you can go after death and before your next birth. And then you perceive them. They're imprinted on your soul. We'll see it's St. Thomas Aquinas saying that God's light, the light of God's countenance, imprinted the forms of reason on our soul, and that mixes well with Plato's idea of the absolute ideas out at the outermost horizon, where God perceives those ideas, and that's what makes God who God is. And also the light of God's countenance there's a strong parallel with the idea of the good in the Cave Allegory. You get out of the cave, you see the sun. Well, you get out of this material 3-dimensional world, you see the idea of the good with the eye of the soul. It's the light of reason and truth, and the shadow of which is the sun and its light for making objects visible to the eye. Things become visible to the eye of the soul through the light of the idea of the good. Okay, so I'll read that again in page 124. So Aquinas distinguishes several different kinds of law. Eternal laws, the law of nature, established by God, that governs the entire universe. Everything in the universe obeys eternal law and does so necessarily. Science investigates eternal law and tries to describe it. Natural law is normative. It prescribes what things should do and be. Since a thing's nature determines its function and thus its virtue, what it ought to do and be, eternal law determines natural law. Natural law is the manifestation of eternal law in creatures capable of rational choice and activity. So we've gone over that. Now the next paragraph, natural law manifests the eternal law by way of the light of natural reason. So that's a quote from Aquinas. God imprints on us the natural ability to tell right from wrong. Aquinas also distinguishes natural law from human law. Natural law is fully general and universal, but human law must apply to particular circumstances in specific ways. Natural law consists of first principles, the starting points for practical reasoning. Because natural law serves as a set of axioms of the moral law, it must be self-evident. It must be general and obvious. Precepts of natural law are true universally and necessarily. Okay, so natural law, although humans must use reason to discern it by studying the eternal law, or the law of nature, the law which includes the laws of physics, it doesn't mean reason makes it up. It just discovers what's inherent already in the eternal law. So it isn't arbitrary, but when you apply what natural law discerns from the eternal law to the everyday life of human beings, then those laws are adjusted to particular circumstances. They're relative to the situation at hand. So natural law is self-evident first principles. So in the United States of America, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that everyone is created equal. So what makes that self-evident, that's up to debate. But Aquinas will say there are a couple of self-evident things, including that all actions are aimed at the good, something good. People act for a reason. The ultimate reason is they want something good. Any animal that acts is trying to achieve something good. So, and I'll get into that when we go through the actual Summa Theologica, but I'm going to continue to go through this introductory notes. So again, natural law manifests the eternal law by way of the light of natural reason. God imprints on us the natural ability to tell right from wrong. Aquinas also distinguishes natural law from human law. Natural law is fully general and universal, but human law must apply to particular circumstances in specific ways. Okay, so natural law is the universal truths that are supposedly self-evident to human reason. So it might seem that natural law, as Aquinas outlines it, has little content. Pursue good, avoid evil. Everyone can agree to that, but what is good? What is evil? Aquinas appeals to human nature. What we are determines what we ought to do and be. So what is human nature? We all have, he'll say, certain instinctive knowledge of what is good and evil. And one of the things we know is good is being. You want to continue to exist. And we also have in common with the animals certain things that are good, such as procreation. And then unique to human beings, we have reason. And that one of the things that's good for humans to use their reason for is to know God. So we'll get into all those details. So I'll just finish off here on page 125. Our own dispositions thus provide a test. We are naturally disposed to pursue good and avoid evil. The natural law is in us in the form of the light of natural reason. Okay, so now I will read from St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. I'm going to not get caught up in the four factors which determine whether an act is good or bad: its genus, its species, its circumstance, and its end, because it's going to get really bogged down in enough detail. But it's the end of an action is an important thing. What's the purpose of your action? Do the ends justify the means? If you have a good goal in mind, does that justify doing some evil things to get it done? Aquinas has a lot of rules about that, which I'm not going to get into. I'm just going to get into the basics of what he thinks reason is and what these absolute ideas are, how they relate to his idea of natural law, and then we're going to compare it to Plato. So if you look on page 126, so you'll see what he does. He writes them, Article 5, whether a human action is good or evil in its species, and then he'll have objection 1, objection 2, objection 3, objection 4, and then he'll respond to each objection. So I'm not going to go through every objection. I'm just going to go through some of his responses to get a basic framework of his idea of natural law, which again is the moral law that humans can discern using reason by analyzing the laws of nature, the eternal laws that God uses to organize the universe, which science studies. From that, we can derive a moral law. So on 126, the bottom of the right-hand column, now in human actions, good and evil are predicated in reference to the reason, because as Dionysius says, the good of man is to be in accord with reason, and evil is to be against reason, for that is good for a thing which suits it in regard to its form, and evil that which is against the order of its form. So it's good to act according to the purpose or the goal for which your form strives. If you're a acorn, you're striving to achieve the form of oak tree. If you're a human being, you're striving to achieve the form of a rational human being who discerns the moral code or the natural law from the laws of the physical universe. All right, I'm going to now skip over to page 129. So whether there is in us a natural law, that's the question. And there's three objections, which I might go back to, but let me just start. Some people say, no, there is no natural law in us. There's only a law of nature is the first objection. God made a law of nature to govern the universe. That's all there is. So there's not another subset of laws created within us. Aquinas will say, I agree, there's not. We just have reason, and reason automatically can discern the natural law from the law of nature, the moral law from the physical law that governs the universe. So on page 129, the right-hand column, on the contrary, a gloss on Romans 2:14, so he quotes from the Bible or other doctors of the church, like St. Augustine and Dionysius we saw. So this is from the book of Romans. When the Gentiles who have not the law do by nature those things that are of the law, comments as follows. Although they have no written law, yet they have the natural law, whereby each one knows and is conscious of what is good and what is evil. So that's a quote from the Bible. Why do the Gentiles follow the Jewish law? They don't follow the Torah. And then the answer is, although they have no written law, yet they have the natural law, whereby each one knows and is conscious of what is good and what is evil. So God has inscribed a natural law on every human being. And what he'll go on to explain is it isn't that God actually wrote down the moral laws like the Ten Commandments on your soul, but God gives you reason, and that the reason, if it just observes through science the laws of nature, it will discover the moral laws, which are eternal and fixed, and they're waiting to be seen. The first principles of morality, the self-evident truths of moral law, is what you have to uncover using reason by studying the laws of the universe, the physical laws, which he calls the laws of nature. So I answer that, as stated above, law, being a rule and measure, can be in a person in two ways. In one way, as in him that rules and measures, and another way, as in that which is ruled and measured. So there is a natural law in humans, in one sense, that all of us are imprinted by God the lawmaker, and also we can use reason to discern laws. So I'll just read what he says here. Wherefore, since all things subject to divine providence are ruled and measured by the eternal law, as we stated above, it is evident that all things partake somewhat of the eternal law, insofar as, namely, from its being imprinted on them, they derive their respective inclinations to their proper acts and ends. So, divine providence has imprinted eternal law on all things by giving them their respective inclinations and the proper acts towards their ends. So God imprinted the eternal law on a squirrel by giving the squirrel the instincts to drive it towards its natural purpose, one of which is gathering acorns and burying them all over the place and building a nest. You know, they don't have just a bird nest, they have a whole encompassing little house. That is, the ability to do that is imprinted on them by God. So now, among all others, the rational creature is subject to divine providence in the most excellent way, insofar as it partakes of a share of providence by being provident both for itself and for others. So providence, it's the care of God, but it's also foresight, looking out for circumstances, being providential. So humans can look into the future and discern what is going to unfold by studying the way things have unfolded in the past. We can get a glimpse of the laws of nature. So Wherefore it has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. This participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. So, I'll read that again, the whole thing. Now, among all others, the rational creature is subject to divine providence in the most excellent way, insofar as it partakes of a share of providence by being provident both for itself and for others. Humans have foresight. Wherefore it has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. And this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. So we have a natural inclination to use reason to study the eternal reason, of which we are a part and parcel. And when we do that, when we study the eternal reason by studying the laws of the lawmaker, the laws of physics, the laws of nature, now, I don't know if he would include in that the laws of psychology, or would those be considered the natural law that reason uncovers. But at any rate, when humans use reason to study the eternal laws that govern the universe, that's our natural inclination. That's what makes us a human being. We have things in common with animals and plants as well, but to be fully human, we use our reason to discover the ideas of God's mind, ultimately, is what he's going to say. So continuing here, hence the psalmist, after saying in Psalm 4:6, offer up the sacrifice of justice, as though someone asked what the works of justice are, adds, many say, who showeth us good things? In answer to which question he says, the light of thy countenance, O Lord, is signed upon us, thus implying that the light of natural reason, whereby we discern what is good and what is evil, which is the function of the natural law, is nothing else than an imprint on us of the divine light. So the psalmist was saying, some people say, how do you know what is good, what is just? And then the answer is, the light of thy countenance signed it upon us. So God's light imprints it upon you. And he uses the word imprint on us of the divine light. It is therefore evident that the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation of the eternal law. So, knowledge of what is good is imprinted on us by the light of God. And the light of God is reason. Reason is like sight to the eyes, so is reason to the soul. We can see the absolute forms of knowledge. We can discern the laws of nature using reason. And from that we can extrapolate what is moral, what is ethical for a human being to do, what is good and what is evil. What is good is good is following reason to achieve the end for which a thing is formed. And evil is going against what reason tells you that thing is formed to do. And humans are formed to do certain things, and he says not to do other things. So, okay, so now over on page 130, the question is whether the natural law contains several precepts or only one. And he'll say it contains one, which is do good and avoid evil, but from that you can discern all of the other laws, the natural law. So again, law of nature is what God creates, and it has to do with the physical workings of the universe. Natural law is the moral code humans can discern using reason by analyzing the physical laws of nature, the eternal laws that God used to create the universe. And this is, by the way, 400 years before Isaac Newton discovered his version of the law of gravity. But it's so he didn't have that in mind, but they had knowledge of science and what science is trying to do. He didn't emphasize mathematics, which Plato will do, and that's how you kind of make this a more comprehensive natural law theory. All right, so I answer that. So is there only one precept in natural law, or are there many? He goes, I answer that as stated above. The precepts of the natural law are to the practical reason what the first principles of demonstrations are to the speculative reason, because both are self-evident principles. Now, a thing is said to be self-evident in two ways. First, in itself. Secondly, in relation to us. Any proposition is said to be self-evident in itself if its predicate is contained in the notion of the subject. All right, so what does that mean? The predicate is contained in the notion of its subject. When I teach about Kant, I'll use the example that I've seen other people teaching about Kant use. Bachelor. A bachelor is an unmarried male. A bachelor is the subject. Is an unmarried male is the predicate. Is the notion of the subject contained in the predicate? Is a bachelor an unmarried male? Yeah, that's just the definition of a bachelor. You don't need to go out and ever meet a bachelor. If you know the definition of what a bachelor is, it's an unmarried male. So that's a self-evident proposition. It's just true by definition. To say all bachelors are messy isn't necessarily true, because there's nothing in the definition of a bachelor that says they have to be messy. It just so happens a lot of bachelors are messy, but it's not true self-evidently, using Aquinas' use of the term self-evident. So first principles are self-evident if the predicate is contained in the notion of the subject, but he's saying some self-evident truths are too complicated for lesser minds to understand, so to them it's not self-evident. He says, but some propositions are self-evident only to the wise, who understand the meaning of the terms of such propositions. Thus, to one who understands that an angel is not a body, it is self-evident that an angel is not circumscriptively in a place. But this is not evident to the unlearned, for they cannot grasp it. So that's these Catholic theologians would talk about all these logical problems with theology, and one of the questions that used to exercise their minds was how many angels can fit on the point of a pin. And the answer is an infinite number, because angels don't have extension in space, so they're not limited by spatial limitations. So that's, I think, what he was referring to there. But that's hard for people to understand. How could something exist if it's not extended in space? So, all right, so some self-evident truths, although they're self-evident, you have to be educated to see that they're self-evident. Just continuing here, page 130. Now, a certain order is to be found in those things that are apprehended universally, for that which before aught else falls under apprehension is being, the notion of which is included in all things whatsoever a man apprehends. Wherefore, the first indemonstrable principle is that the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time, which is based on the notion of being and not being. And on this principle all others are based, as is stated in Metaphysics, section 4, text 9, that's from Aristotle. Now, as being is the first thing that falls under the apprehension simply, so good is the first thing that falls under the apprehension of the practical reason, which is directed to action. So I'm going to go through this piece by piece. Since every agent acts for an end under the aspect of good. All right, so for that which before all else falls under apprehension is being. So the first thing, the first concept that you're aware of when you have any awareness of all, he'll say, is the awareness of being. We went over this with St. Augustine when he was saying that each of us contains in our rational thought an image of the Trinity. So the Trinity is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And the God the Father is known through the simple fact that you know that you exist. I am. So God says in the Bible, I am who am. So just being itself, that's the first principle of understanding. And from that, things exist, you can understand that the same thing can't be, one thing and another at the same time. So that's a principle of logic. So being, we know of, you're just speculating about existence. What exists? Being. Beingness exists. All right, so, but if you start to think about what should I do, then the first principle is good. Because what I should do means an action which is always aimed at an end or a purpose. And what all purposes have in common is it appears good to you. You're doing something to achieve something that you think is good. So with that in mind, I'll read this again. So, Now a certain order is to be found in those things that are apprehended universally, for that which being aught else falls under apprehension is being, the notion of which is included in all things whatsoever a man apprehends. You always see things in the frame of being. Wherefore the first indemonstrable principle is that the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time. Indemonstrable principle is his way of saying self-evident truth. How can you prove that the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time? And he'll say, I can't prove it. I just appeal to the fact that the concept that we all universally hold is being. We know what being is. A thing is, or it isn't. So a thing can't be and not be at the same time. And so you can't tell me that, where's this, that the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time. So that's the first law of logic. You said, which is based on the notion of being and not being. All right, so there you have it. That's the first principle of just apprehension in general. Well, what about the first principle of practical action, which is the realm of ethics? Now, as being is the first thing that falls under the apprehension simply, so good, in quotation marks, is the first thing that falls under the apprehension of the practical reason. So putting it into practice, which is directed to action, since every agent acts for an end under the aspect of good. Consequently, the first principle of practical reason is one founded on the notion of good, that good is that which all things seek after. That's the first principle of ethics. Good is that which all things seek after. Hence, this is the first precept of law, that good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. All other precepts of the natural law are based upon this, so that whatever the practical reason naturally apprehends as man's good or evil belongs to the precepts of the natural law as something to be done or avoided. Okay, so the first self-evident truth that we all know is being. Things exist. We know what being is, and therefore we know the difference between being and not being, and therefore you can't say one thing is this way and another way at the same time. So the first principle of practical reason is that all objects, good is that which all things seek after, so that you should do good and avoid evil. And then using reason, you can discern a lot of other precepts of the natural law. So continuing here, he says, since, however, good has the nature of an end, and evil the nature of a contrary, hence it is that all those things to which man has a natural inclination are naturally apprehended by reason as being good, and consequently as objects of pursuit, and their contraries as evil, and objects of avoidance. Wherefore, according to the order of natural inclinations, is the order of the precepts of the natural law. All right, so here's the natural law now. What's the first natural law about your ethical conduct? Because in man there is first of all an inclination to good in accordance with the nature which he has in common with all substances. And what does he have in common with all substances? They all exist. They all have being. As we saw, that was the first thing you know simply by knowing. Being, that's the first concept according to Thomas Aquinas. All right, so first of all, an inclination to do good in accordance with the nature which he has in common with all substances, inasmuch as every substance seeks the preservation of its own being, according to its nature. And by reason of this inclination, whatever is a means of preserving human life and of warding off its obstacles belongs to the natural law. So, that would be the first natural law, the first moral law that humans can discern using reason and studying the laws of nature. All living beings want to continue to live. Even a worm will struggle to get away and save its life. Bugs are terrified if you touch them. They know that their life is endangered. Everything wants to continue to preserve its life, so the first ethical law is preserve human life. Thou shalt not kill, I guess is what he's saying here. So secondly, there is in man an inclination to things that pertain to him more specially, according to that nature which he has in common with other animals. Okay, so the other animals, I'll just continue to read here, that which nature has taught to all animals. He's quoting somebody whose abbreviated name is there, such as sexual intercourse, education of offspring, and so forth. So those are good things for humans. It's natural that humans have sexual intercourse. Our bodies are clearly created for that, so Aquinas would say. The male and the female generative organs, they fit together. That's a natural form. It has a function of procreation. Then you have children, and all the species educate their young. Well, probably not all, certainly not all, but a lot do. So humans that should educate their young, that's another ethical. It would be immoral not to educate your offspring. Why? Because that's the natural function of a human, like it is the natural function of other. And the Catholic Church bases its sexual morality on St. Thomas Aquinas's theory here. So sexual intercourse that's not for procreation is immoral according to the Church because it's not fulfilling the function of procreation. So you can say, well, that's one of the functions for sex. There's other functions as well. How can you tell which has priority over the other? But at any rate, to get an idea of the logic behind it, this is where it's coming from. So continuing, thirdly, there is in man an inclination to good according to the nature of his reason, which nature is proper to him, meaning it distinguishes us as the human species. Thus man has a natural inclination to know the truth about God and to live in society. And in this respect, whatever pertains to this inclination belongs to the natural law, for instance, to shun ignorance, to avoid offending others among whom one has to live, and other such things regarding the above inclination. So he says, in reply to that, there's only one natural law. He says, all these precepts of the law of nature have the character of one natural law, inasmuch as they all flow from one first precept. The first precept is, good is to be done, evil is to be avoided. From that first precept of what your reason can discern, that is a self-evident truth. All actions are aimed at achieving something good. So that's the way God created it. Therefore, to seek the good is moral, and to not seek the good is evil. What is it? What is good for the human being? What function does the human have to fulfill in order to be a good human? We have to use our reason to discern God's ideas that created the natural law that governs the universe, from which we can discern the moral law, or it's God creates the laws of nature, and then we discern the natural law using reason by studying the laws of nature. It's just semantics. It's how it's been translated. So natural law in this text means the moral code. All right, so we've gone over St. Thomas Aquinas, and now let's combine that with Plato's the Phaedrus and the Cave Allegory. So the light of God's countenance. Let me just briefly review some of the key phrases that we're going to be comparing here. When somebody said, the question was, who knows what is good or what is just? And the answer was, the light of thy countenance, O Lord, is shined upon us. This is from Psalms 4:6. Thus implying that the light of natural reason, whereby we discern what is good and what is evil, which is the function of the natural law, is nothing else than an imprint on us of the divine light. The divine light is human reason. Human reason enables us to discern what is good. So in the Cave Allegory, the divine light is the idea of the good, the shadow of which is the visible sun. The idea of the good contains all of the other absolute ideas, the absolute idea of justice, of beauty and courage, as well as the idea of tree and table and every other thing that you could perceive in the three-dimensional everyday world, of the physical temporal world that's always changing. So the idea of the good contains all of the absolute ideas, and it also shines the light that enables us to see them. And Augustine very simply took Plato's idea of the good and called it God. And you can apply that same procedure to St. Thomas Aquinas here. All right, so the light of thy countenance is shined upon us. And that's similar to what Plato said in the Cave Allegory. And then the idea of the good here. So he says on page 130, the right-hand column, bottom paragraph. It was a complicated paragraph, but it contains two important words, being and good. For Plato in the Cave Allegory, the idea of the good is the source of being. It's beyond being because it's the source of being itself. It's the utmost category of existence that gives being to everything else. And so when you perceive that idea of the good, then and then only will you know what is good for everything to do. You have to perceive that idea of the good in order to be just. And so you can combine that with St. Thomas Aquinas. Well, okay, how does the light of human reason discern what is good? Well, then you combine that with the Phaedrus, and you have to realize that the idea of the good is the outermost sphere of the universe, inasmuch as the idea of the good contains all of the other absolute ideas, and all of the other absolute ideas are contained out there at this outermost heaven, above the visible heavens, where the soul goes after death. And those are the ideas that God perceives all the time, and that's what makes God who God is. So now, with that in mind, I'll now go to, first I'll go to the Phaedrus. So this is page 257. And on the right-hand column, he's talking about the demigods. When the soul, which he compares to a chariot, he goes, well, for now, let's just call it a composite being. You've got a chariot driver and two horses. One is noble and one is ignoble. The ignoble one is physical desire. The noble one is the chivalrous passion that obeys the reason, which is the chariot driver. And so the chariot driver has to control these. One, ignoble horse is always pulling downward, and the noble horse is willing to go up. They want to go up because that's where they can feed the horses on the pasturage of truth, where it will nourish their wings and enable them to fly. But if you've been habituated during life to engage in bodily pleasures all the time, then that ignoble horse just keeps pulling down, 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 and you never get all the way back out to see these absolute forms. So page 257, right-hand column. But when they go to banquet and festival, this is the demigods, then they move up the steep to the top of the vault of heaven, the chariots of the gods in even poise, obeying the rein and gliding rapidly. The other ones are filled with conflict. For the immortals, when they are at the end of their course, go forth and stand upon the outside of heaven. The revolution of the spheres carries them around, and they behold the things beyond. So there abides the very being with which true knowledge is concerned. The colorless, formless, intangible essence, visible only to the mind, the pilot of the soul. So that's the essence of all of the absolute ideas. He said, absolute knowledge in existence, absolute. All the true existences are there. And so he talks about souls struggle to get there. Some get a glimpse, some never make it all the way, and they get crippled and fall back to the earthly sphere. And then it determines your next life on how much of the truth you've seen. He says, but the soul which has never seen the truth, this is page 258, the right-hand column, will not pass into the human form, for a man must have intelligence of universals and be able to proceed from the many particulars of sense to one conception of reason. All right, so that's what Aquinas is saying too. You have to use your reason to study the universal laws of nature, which are the ideas, these absolute ideas. And again, if you remember the divided line, the two sections of the eternal world of absolute forms, the bottom section is the mathematical forms, like the laws of physics. You have to use reason to study the many particular physical examples from which you can discover the eternal mathematical law of physics that governs all of those particular things. The universal truths of mathematical physics, reason can discern, and then those are just reflections of the higher level of absolute ideas, like the idea of justice. So that would be what Aquinas calls natural law. So studying the laws of physics is an important part of discovering the moral laws that humans should obey. So continuing here, for a man must have intelligence of universals and be able to proceed from the many particulars of sense to one conception of reason. This is the recollection of those things which our soul once saw while following God. And therefore the mind of the philosopher alone has wings. This is just, for he is always, according to the measure of his abilities, clinging in recollection to those things in which God abides. In beholding them, he is what he is. And he who employs aright these memories is ever being initiated into perfect mysteries, and alone becomes truly perfect. But as he forgets earthly interests and is wrapped in the divine, the vulgar deem him mad and rebuke him. They do not see that he is inspired. So that we saw also in the Cave Allegory. But you see there, God abides in this outermost sphere of the universe. And so in beholding them, he is what he is. So when we go out in between incarnations and physical forms and reacquaint ourselves with these absolute ideas. So he doesn't stress so much that these ideas are imprinted on our souls here, as much as he says that our souls go out to where they are imprinted on the outermost sphere of the universe, and then we can remember them using reason. But he does imply that our soul is one with that outermost sphere, in which case those absolute ideas would be imprinted on our soul. So if you look back on page 257, the left-hand column, the bottom paragraph, Socrates says, I'll endeavor to explain to you how the mortal differs from the immortal creature. The soul in her totality has the care of inanimate being everywhere and traverses the whole heaven, appearing in diverse forms. When perfect and fully winged, she soars upward and orders the whole world. So the soul in her totality is the universal soul, and we participate in that universal soul, and our souls, they merge back with that universal soul in between our reincarnations. So it's not just that, oh, our souls are a blank tablet and then we go and remember, although that could be kind of implied when he's saying, you go out there and you see them when you're there, but then what? You forget them? Yeah, you forget them, but they're still there imprinted on your soul, which is important for Aquinas. So it is for Plato too. Plato's called a rationalist because he says we can use reason to discern the absolute ideas. And that is what Aquinas is also saying. But Aquinas isn't talking about reincarnation, and he's not specifically talking about the outermost sphere, although he does elsewhere talk about that. He does know about the importance of the outermost sphere of the universe, but it's not in our little segment of the Summa Theologica. Okay, so now we're going to go to the Cave Allegory. And so I've gone over the 4 segments of the divided line, and it's important to note the bottom segment of the intellectual world, the eternal world of eternal forms, is the laws of mathematical physics, including geometry, just the basic laws of geometry. When you're thinking about a Pythagorean theorem of a right angle triangle, a 90-degree triangle, where one of the angles is 90 degrees, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. One of the legs plus squared plus this squared equals the hypotenuse squared. And you use visible triangles on a piece of paper to help teach that, so that the actual physical triangles here, you could have a shadow of one or an image, a mirror reflection of one, but the 3-dimensional triangle that you're studying to learn geometry is like a shadow of the absolute idea, and the Pythagorean theorem would be that's a lower level of an eternal form. And then those are like shadows or reflections of the next level up. And that next level up would include the normative laws, like what is just. So that's just important for Aquinas, because the natural law, which is human reason discerns the moral law, he calls it natural law by studying the law of nature, which is the universal laws of physics. We see that in Aquinas, and you can see that in the divided line analogy for Plato. And then after the Cave Allegory, he says you must educate the potential philosopher kings in mathematics and geometry and music, he'll say. Then study each dimension. Dimensionless numbers, 2-dimensional geometry, 3-dimensional solid geometry, then solid geometry in motion, which is astronomy, the planets, which is the study of the 4th dimension of time. And then you have to see how they're all combined. And music also studies time. So the study of physics, and specifically astronomy, the mathematical laws that govern the movement of the planets, if you can learn those, that's like a reflection of the higher laws, which would include the laws of morality, or what Aquinas is calling natural laws. Okay, so I went through the cave allegory and how we're like prisoners in a cave and we have to get out of this to see that these three-dimensional objects are reflections of the absolute forms outside of the cave, which we know from the Phaedrus are in the outermost sphere of the universe. And then, so I'll just read about this. So for Aquinas, the light of God's countenance imprints upon us the truths of the natural law. So here's about the idea of the good. Is the ultimate form to be seen, and I'll just read that. So he says, so analyzing the cave allegory, this entire allegory, I said, you may now pen, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument. The prison house is the world of sight. So he's saying the cave is what we are living in. And the sun is, the fire in the cave is like the sun. So the prison house is the world of sight. The light of the fire is the sun, and you won't misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world. According to my poor belief, which at your desire I have expressed, whether rightly or wrongly, God knows, but whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all, and is seen only with an effort. When seen, it's also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual. This is the power upon which he who would act rationally in either public or private life must have his eye fixed. So we saw Aquinas say the first self-evident truth of practical reason, which is action, practicing anything, is that do good and avoid evil, because all actions are aimed at achieving some good. You get up in the morning because if you didn't, you wouldn't be able to get to school or get to work. You need to do that. You know, you're guided to achieve different goods. That's the first thing that practical reason realizes. But according to Socrates, it's what the idea of the good is the last thing, only with an extreme effort, that you'll be able to understand. And if you don't open up the eye of your soul, which is your reason, to the idea of the good, then you cannot act rationally, either in public or private life. So when you're combining all of these elements of St. Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory with Plato's Phaedrus and the cave allegory, you just want to keep these elements in mind. That reason is the light of the idea of the good, which Aquinas calls God. And in the Phaedrus, Plato says, or he had Socrates say, that God is God because God perceives these absolute ideas and that we have to perceive them. The difference between Aquinas and Plato is Plato talks about reincarnation, so you would want to include that, and that we perceive these ideas after we die if we've trained ourselves during life. And also this idea of studying the laws of nature, the mathematical laws of physics, using science to help us discern what is good for a human to do. That we can know what the form of a human being was created with a purpose in mind by God, and we can use reason to discern what the function of a human being is. And the ultimate function of a human is to behave rationally, to use our reason to understand the truth of God, for example, is the highest purpose for the human form. And for Plato, the ultimate goal is to use reason to discover the idea of the good. So I've gone over these elements a few times. It's enough. If you choose to do this one, this is an introductory class, obviously. I'm not expecting you to reinvent ethics, but just keep those basic elements in mind so that I know you've thought about them, and then I will be satisfied that you have been introduced to some important ideas in world philosophy.